Greatest of all time gets thrown around a lot in mixed martial arts, and that honor has certainly changed hands through the years. But it's very rare that the promoter themselves will openly declare a fighter the best champion the UFC has ever seen. So how do you go from that to being erased from the history books entirely?
Because you're a two-faced lion chump. That's what you are, Frank Shamrock. What have you done? You haven't done anything. You're just a liar and a guy who's trying to keep himself relevant.
What? So Uncle Fester, Dana White, you better get your fat ass in shape and you better get ready to get beaten down.
The UFC has had reason not to include people in the Hall of Fame, but they've usually done it anyway. Former middleweight champion Rich Franklin went to work for one championship. He's still in it. Even Chael Sonnen, who went to fight for the enemy Bellator, has managed to secure a place amongst the honored UFC greats.
When you look at the pantheon of the greatest mixed martial artists, you should begin with Frank Shamrock.
It's a question that we're going to ask today, as the man it concerns was widely acknowledged in his time as the most complete martial artist on the planet, and in the 90s, the fighter of the decade.
He's a five-time undefeated UFC middleweight champion. He was a fighter of the decade for the 1990s.
Shamrock is the pioneer of a true mixed martial artist. They say he's the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be.
My hero, Frank Shamrock, now has my old job. You were the beginning
Joe
of the future.
Rogan.
Guys who can stand up and who are deadly on the ground. You were the first guy. You were the future. Well, you heard it here from Joe Rogan.
And a man who took hold of the sport and dragged the UFC out of the dark ages, where two men entered and one man was supposed to leave. Fans were transformed for the first time ever from just bleed to wanting to witness an unbelievable execution of martial arts skill and technique.
Thunderdome, baby. Two men enter, one man leaves.
Calling ultimate fighting a sport is a complete misnomer. We should be looking to make it illegal.
It really is an art. It's a human chess match. But there's always respect. There's always honor.
Today, I'm talking about the legend Frank Shamrock and how the UFC erased the first MMA GOAT from history.
Yeah, the UFC be doing crazy shit.
Chapter 1, MMA in the 90s. To understand the impact someone like Frank had on the UFC, you've got to understand what a seemingly unrelated thing in pro wrestling was like in the mid-90s. But in fact, the two were intermingled quite heavily from the start. Back then, mixed martial arts was an underground fringe product hidden away on the blockbuster shelves next to the other adult material. The only success they'd ever had was to promote the UFC as some kind of blood sport. But even that hadn't been enough to dwarf the biggest thing in sports entertainment, the Attitude Era of the WWE, or then the WWF. And it completely took hold of pop culture and the United States, going more extreme than it ever had. And it's where UFC star Ken Shamrock had found a home after.
Oh, Ken Shamrock. So it's okay, but the Attitude Era. Hey, we might gotta do a reaction there. But look, man,
he competed in the early UFC.
This is crazy.
Why? Well, despite Ken being one of the greatest pound-for-pound fighters in the world at the time, there was more fame, more attention, and more importantly, more money in professional wrestling. The UFC was for barbarians, as it was accused in those days. And with every passing year, the light at the end of the tunnel had gotten darker and darker as the regulatory bodies and a witch hunt led by US senators clenched jaws around the infancy of mixed martial arts. But all of that was about to change. Not through Ken, though, despite his newfound fame, but rather in his brother, Frank Shamrock.
Word? So his brother was a wrestler.
Frank, the same as Ken, wasn't born a Shamrock at all. His name was Frank Juarez, and his childhood, sadly, like so many others in MMA, was full of abuse and neglection. Even by the age of 7, he was already doing things no child should.
I was already drinking in the park with the hobos by the time I was 7.
Dang. What my mother did as a form of punishment was lock me in the closet.
His behavior started to spiral out of control, and he'd find himself locked up for the very first time.
I'd stolen like a bottle of schnapps or something, and I was getting a girl's drunk in the backyard. And my sister Susie was there, and she was like, I'm telling you, and grabbed a knife, and I told her, don't you ever tell on me, I'll kill you. Police came, and...
He was crazy, huh? Hey, look, man, let me know who to react to next, discover next. But y'all told me to react to my boy. Well, y'all, boy, I'm just discovering him. So we here.
Next thing I knew, I was sitting in a jail cell.
I have 23 felony convictions. I got my first felony when I was 11.
23?
I got another when I was 12. And I got another when I was 13. And then when I was 17, I got 20 felonies in succession in one time.
Frank found himself in a juvenile facility surrounded by other kids who'd already seen their lives travel down the wrong path.
Biggest eye-opener I'd ever seen was hanging out with the bad kids, talking to them. I'm getting locked in closets and I'm getting beat. You know, I'm doing these things are happening to me and they're stressing me out.
starting a pattern that would continue for several years
Childhood
until
be
his
fucking these
relationship with his own
fighters up,
family
boy.
started to break down entirely.
I was abused, I was
Damn.
tortured, everything you could imagine happened to me. And I found crime to be the perfect outlet. And I wasn't a bad person, I didn't hurt people. But I took what I wanted and did what I wanted. Breaking and entering, selling, receiving, grand theft, grand larceny.
If I didn't like the group home, if I didn't like the team, things got rough, I'd commit a crime, take me back to juvenile hall. So I did 5 or 6 homes before I met Bob Shamrock.
I grew up without a family. I gave up my family because...
Oh! So this nigga name wasn't even Shamrock. Hold on, I knew his name wasn't Shamrock because they said it. But he got his name. Hold on, this is insane.
This is where Frank would meet Ken Shamrock for the first time. Now,
That's
Bob
not
had a
his
lot of
brother?
kids at his ranch, but Ken was his favorite.
Bro, that's not his brother? So that's not his blood brother. Is y'all telling me the whole time I'm thinking that's his blood brother, that's not his blood brother? Somebody gotta explain it. Somebody gotta... Bro, what?
And he'd even adopted him legally and given him the name Shamrock. Ken had also had a rough childhood, being homeless at 10 and having to fight people in the streets for food until he was taken in by Bob Shamrock.
Bob tells 15 of his boys, if you can hold him down so I can spank him for his birthday, I'll take you all to Trader Joe or Trader Vic's. And so I'm like, yeah, guys, come on, let's do this. I'm the only dude who steps forward. Ken literally just grabs my face and sticks my entire head on the ground, and I can't move. So I'm stuck like this.
At the home, Frank's life was immediately changed.
Shout out to Bob
Shamrock, because it was like
man.
a family. You know, it was like different. You know, I grew up in a broken family with everything it didn't make sense. I had 20 brothers, and we were strong. We had our own team, like soccer, football, baseball, didn't matter. We had 20 boys. We healed each other, you know, in that little moment.
But he hadn't entirely let go of the person he was. Once his girlfriend became pregnant when Frank was just 16, he quickly, again, lost control of his life. As Frank tells it, he started using huge amounts of crystal meth and was snorting or smoking at least $100 a day. The only way he could sustain that habit was to turn to a life of crime once again, and he began stealing anything he could get his hands on, breaking into houses. But when that wasn't enough, he started targeting businesses like his local golf club. Frank had managed to get a job at Taco Bell, but after disliking the way they treated him, he decided he would rob that too. He broke in at night and emptied the cash register before opening the safe and grabbing the cash, all in time for the cops to arrive and a foot chase to ensue. He was arrested and sentenced to 6 years in prison.
Damn, he's talking about rob that too. What are you talking about, man?
I went to prison when I was 18 years old, and I voluntarily transferred myself to state prison out of California Youth Authority.
The whole thing was just a little too much for me. It was commonplace to go around stabbing people with pencils and fighting each other and, you know, battling over turf.
In his biography, Frank called it Lord of the Flies, and he realized he needed to change his life, and despite being in prison, Bob Shamrock was still helping him.
You know, he started writing me right away. He's like, screwed up. Invest in your body, invest in your mind. Like, you ain't going anywhere for 3.5 years. Start the work, because when you're done with the work, there'll be opportunity.
He started studying and working towards a college education, but that didn't mean he didn't run into his fair share of problems in prison either.
I'm in there watching TV one night, and a couple black guys come in, turn the channel to Live in Color. Oh, hey guys, you know, Mr. Nice Guy over here. Hey brother, it's the Other's TV night. I'm the Other. 3-4 more guys come in.
Live in Color, fire
3-4 more guys come in, and it's like 8 dudes standing around. Hey, excuse me 1 minute. And the biggest dude turns around and goes, yeah, fuck you. In prison, that means he's punking me and bitching me. So I went in the bathroom, got the mop ring, a big plastic mop ring, an industrial sized one. I got some pencils, stuck them in my thing. I smashed the first dude with that mop ringer, and his whole head exploded. And then I pulled those pencils out and started poking fools. And I fought these 8 dudes until the police came. It's 60 days in the hole, because I wouldn't tell anybody. No, you know, all right, you're going back. And I go, where am I going? And I go, back to the same yard. And like, yeah, but we've moved those other guys. So the next day in the kitchen, I'm sitting there by myself. I used to always read in the corner of my back to the wall after my work. 50, 60 dudes come in the room, shut the door. They're like, you're a rat, and we're gonna kill you. I just closed my book, and I stood up, and I said, I ain't no fucking rat. You're gonna kill me, let's do this. And they all went, no, we're good. Level 2, nobody's tough. They were like, no, we're good. You're right, that makes sense. They all laughed.
Frank had spent almost his entire life locked up in one facility or another. Youth homes, group crisis centers, or prison. The state paroled him out into the care of Bob Shamrock, who told him he's got 2 options.
You're handsome, you got a great body, you could be a great stripper. Or you could try this martial arts and wrestling thing.
You told him he could be a stripper.
I had no choice.
He keeping it real with you.
That I had 23 felony convictions. Not like I'm going to get a job.
He kept it real with you, I ain't gonna lie.
Bob was talking about sending him to live with his brother Ken. Now, Ken had already begun a career in pro wrestling while Frank was in the middle of his prison sentence. But the year before Frank's release, he had in 1993 begun fighting in Japan in the hybrid MMA organization known as Pancrase, and then, of course, onto the UFC. Ken had his own gym in Lodi, California, known only as the Lion's Den, a place of complete legends full of savages, and very soon, Frank's own personal hell.
I was in college and my dad called me and he said, you got to meet this kid. You know, he's a good kid. He's got some problems, but man, I think if you can hook up with him and maybe, you know, mentor him a little bit, you guys are kind of the same. You know, Frank's gonna be on parole. I said, well, what do you need me to do? And he goes, maybe you can do about getting Frank placed up here with you.
Just one day after his prison release, April 7th, 1994, Frank made the journey to the Lion's Den.
Well, I was just deathly afraid to go to the Lion's Den. I mean, I didn't know anything about fighting.
But Ken hadn't even agreed to train him, only to give him what they called a tryout.
Ken didn't want me there. No,
really?
No. Yeah.
Ken didn't want you at Lion's Den?
No, not at all.
Do you feel he always had your best interest at heart, though, when you guys were coming up?
No.
No.
Usually I did the initiations and I beat the crap out of people.
The tryout was pretty gnarly. 500 squats, 500 sit-up, 500 leg lifts. He broke my rib, broke my nose, tore my knees out. You know, Ken didn't really want me there. My dad was sort of made him do it, and he kind of resented it in the way that, you know, I wasn't a fighter and I wasn't an athlete.
But I knew when he came out with that swagger and his attitude that I had to be one, because he had to respect me. And so I did it.
It was the old method for the Japanese Pancrase dojo. And really the goal was to completely exhaust you, mind, body, and spirit, and to beat you to the point where you thought you were going to die.
But he'd survived more than 20 minutes and would be allowed to stay at the Lion's Den.
I don't even think I ever hit Ken. Like, he just literally beat the living shit out of me. But there's nothing you can do after 500 squats, sit-ups, push-ups, and leg lifts. You're literally so physically spent.
But that's why we had all the world champions. That's why Frank became a world champion. That's why Frank became the man he is today. He knows he can go through it. He knows there's nothing worse he has to go through.
This was Ken's attitude, and he ran the gym like a Japanese dojo, which meant for the first few weeks, Frank was little more than a slave. This apparently went on for several months, and no one taught him anything. Frank has called Ken a bully with no patience. It apparently wasn't a dojo, but a gym with guys just working out and fighting each other. So Frank started to write things down, drawing pictures of the moves, drawing on the same focus he found while studying in prison. He realized that fighting was indeed a sport with moves and techniques, and after 6 months, he finally beat someone in sparring, and Ken decided he was ready for his first fight.
Okay. I just can't believe they're not brothers, bro.
The Path of the Warrior.
That's
Frank
crazy.
arrived midwinter to a cold and wet Japan and a tin-roof dojo smelling of sewage, where he was the only one who could speak English, and there he stayed for 8 weeks training with the Japanese fighters under one of the Pancrase founders, Funaki.
I lived in Kanagawa in the Pancrase dojo, and they
Y'all want a
understood
Funaki
the
reaction?
finer
Let me know in the
mechanics
comments.
of fighting. So like when Funaki taught me about balance and control, he brought out a ball and a stick.
Although he was being shown more techniques, he once again felt even more isolated than he had in prison. And after his 8 weeks were up, it was time for his first fight ever, and he did something truly incredible. Despite never having an organized fight, Frank was entered into the King of Pancrase competition, and his first ever opponent
we here for
was going to
this.
be Bas Rutten.
And then everybody asked me, "Oh, who are you gonna fight?" And I'd say, "Bas Rutten." And they'd all
Why would they do him like that?
look down like this. I'd be like, "That's not a good look. Like, why is everybody looking down?" Because they thought he was gonna murder me. That's why.
Bas already had years of kickboxing
look at
experience,
him.
had been a European champion, and already had 8 fights in Pancrase, losing to only the best.
I mean, I was in prison 8 months before I fought Bas Rutten. So when I got out, I didn't even know what this sport was. I didn't know what was going on.
You just
I
know
didn't
you're
see
going
it on
against a
TV.
legend.
For Frank, this wasn't competition.
Just know that.
The lights and the crowd sent electricity through his body, and he was absolutely terrified, feeling like he was fighting for his life.
Boss just kicked me right in the nose, broke the end of my nose off.
At the time, I was just terrified and just trying to survive and not get killed.
After a back and forth contest where Frank thought he was literally going to die, up until that point in his life, that's all Frank had ever known about fighting. It was always a fight for your life. Incredibly, in his first pro fight, Frank was declared the winner.
The day I got back from Japan, Bob told me he was going to adopt me. I became Frank Shamrock.
He went up against his Japanese master, Masakatsu
Hold
Funaki,
on.
when he took the...
Oh, did they say he beat Bas Rutten, bro? That's what they just said, bro. Don't play with me. Don't play with me.
Pancrase found a 10 full minutes, all before Frank managed to lock in a toe hold and secure the win. It all led to his chance at the interim Pancrase Openweight Championship against the incredible Minoru Suzuki. A win would guarantee him another chance at Bas Rutten and a chance to be world champion.
Shit's like a
but it was
movie.
not going to be easy. In another epic battle that went on for 23 minutes, Frank gave Suzuki all he could handle before eventually trapping him in a knee bar and forcing the tap and officially becoming interim world champion. But the rematch with Bas did not go his way. He wouldn't be able to claim the title King of Pancrase as his brother Ken had done. And Frank had admittedly started to get carried away with the rock and roll lifestyle he had in Japan.
You know, we come back to the States and we just train our ass off, and then you go there and you're like a rock star. You know how it is. It's, you know, girls, whatever. It's just like amazing. It's like being a rock star overnight.
And then things really started going downhill. At the 1996 Adversary show, Frank took on Yuki Kondo and looked very, very tired. I mean, he could barely stand up. And then Kondo dropped the hammer and knocked Frank literally out of the ring. Ken's relationship with Pancrase had also begun to sour with disputes over contracts. And at the same time, the UFC as it was and the marketing they'd done to make it seem like a hardcore fight to the death started to backfire as US senators made it their mission to bring down the sport entirely. And so in what seemed like the most sensible business move, in 1997 Ken Shamrock walked into the WWE for the first time. And because Ken was no longer with Pancrase, it seemed like they also had no more interest in doing business with Frank. For the first time ever, he would fight on US soil heading to Super Brawl 3 in Hawaii. And Frank found himself in a 30-minute war. And even though he knocked out Loba's two front teeth and broke his ankle, the man would not stop coming forward. Shamrock literally thought the guy was on some kind of drugs, and he lost a split decision in what was a massive upset. Frank was also humiliated and embarrassed by the performance, and he knew why he'd lost. So Frank Shamrock took a bike up Diamond Head Volcano in Honolulu and had a revelation. This was what he was going to do with his life, and he would accept nothing less than complete and total dedication. He said that this was his true beginning as a fighter. He returned to the Lion's Den with this new attitude in mind, wanting to make changes, but it was his entire world that was again about to be flipped upside down. While Ken had been away wrestling with WWE, he left Frank in charge of the Lion's Den to run the training sessions and keep his program going.
He put me in charge, but I was given no power or sort of authority to do anything.
So I was coming up with new and different ideas because it seemed like we should be evolving and using, you know, science, biomechanics. And I was thinking about completing the circles, making the whole thing a system, you know. Took the boys to Japan for a performance and it was crap. Like everyone did bad. And so when I came home, he was just pissed.
Pissed was an understatement. He called Frank into his office and he lit him up.
He came in and one night he just totally freaked out on me. Ken told me that I don't have what it takes. I'm not going to be a world champion. I'm never going to be a world champion. And I should focus on what I'm good at, running his gyms his way.
Frank had had enough and so decided to part ways with his brother and the Lion's Den forever. But he didn't realize that also meant parting ways with his new family.
I called my dad the next day and he goes, son, you have to get right with Ken. And you know, until you do that, we can't have a relationship.
I felt he disrespected me, so I split from him and my father. Ken never forgave me for that.
But Frank knew he couldn't stay at the Lion's Den if he wanted to develop as a fighter, and so he started trying to start his own team, but nobody would train with him.
And then once I made the decision to leave, this is the part that really upset me. He told everybody, you can't train with them, Frank's not with us.
If you ever feel like you don't want to be here, let me know. I'll give you my blessing. Just tell me. Don't run out in the middle of the night. And that's what he did.
It turns out the only guy associated with the Lion's Den who would take Frank's calls was Maurice Smith, but Maurice was happy to work with Frank, and it just so happened that around the same time, he got a call to take on the UFC heavyweight champion, Mark Coleman. It was this point as well that Maurice introduced Frank to another legend of the MMA scene, Javier Mendez and his gym in San Jose, California, the American Kickboxing Academy. Frank had gone to Javier because he'd gotten a fantastic opportunity, a chance to fight Enson Inoue in Vale Tudo in Japan, and the winner was going to get a shot at the UFC title. Enson Inoue had just won the Shooto Heavyweight Championship, and he gave Shamrock all he could handle.
Oh shit. Oh!
He was going to the UFC, and Frank's opponent, a gold medal winning Olympic wrestler named Kevin Jackson, who dominated all of his UFC opponents so far. But in a sport that was quickly evolving, Kevin was a pure wrestler, and Frank knew exactly how to exploit his weakness.
Frank said he's got Kevin Jackson. I'm going, what? Kevin Jackson? He goes, oh, yeah, I'm going to armbar him. And I'm like, okay.
Frank was full of confidence going into his first UFC fight. It was back in Japan, and he already had a game plan in his mind. He watched the tapes over and over, and as Kevin shoots and postures up, he was going to throw an armbar. And he tapped him in just 16 seconds. The fastest submission in UFC title history for the next 20 years. The UFC immediately recognized what Frank Shamrock could be, a star. For UFC 16 and his first title defense, all the promotion was about Frank Shamrock. Frank's opponent was Igor Zinoviev, a veteran and feared Russian kickboxer and sambo specialist. But immediately, Shamrock shot a double leg takedown and slammed Zinoviev so hard that it knocked him unconscious. He suffered a broken collarbone and
fatality.
Bro, he knocked him out for a slam. Look at him, he's stiff. Bro, what the
fractured C5 vertebrae from the slam and had to be carried out on a stretcher. His fight with Frank Shamrock forced him to retire permanently.
Yeah, he got destroyed. I felt bad.
And just 2 months later, at the very next UFC, Frank was ready to come back and defend his title.
God.
But the image of the sport was still deteriorating. They'd been thrown off Time Warner Cable, and venues just shut them down across the country. Bob Merowitz, the owner, and Frank came up with a plan to show that the fighters were more than just these barbarians. First, they asked Frank to come to New York to talk about how they could grow the sport. And then they had the idea to make Frank an MMA sports personality and commentator. Now, if you buy the UFC 17 DVD, you'll notice that Frank Shamrock defending his belt against Jeremy Horn is not on the tapes, but if you watch back the event on Fight Pass, it's kind of just bolted onto the end of the video. That's because his title fight was actually the first fight of the night, and it was for the live audience only. Frank put on a gutsy display against Jeremy, and they both grappled and worked each other into overtime, where Frank was finally able to secure the knee bar and force a tap. He then ran backstage, put on a suit, and joined the production team cage side to commentate the final of the middleweight tournament.
He's looking sharp. He's really on his game tonight. I don't know if Dan's got the energy to take him out.
His next fight in the UFC, though, would be perhaps not only his greatest performance, but the greatest fight to ever happen inside the octagon. And it involved not only Frank, but his whole family once again. But what happens next is enough for most people to secure him a place in the UFC Hall of Fame.
What the fuck did he do?
Chapter 3, the greatest of all time. While the UFC had slowly had these regulatory vices being closed around it, Ken Shamrock had stepped away from the octagon to wrestle in the WWE. But that doesn't mean he wasn't cornering other fighters inside the UFC. And against his team, the Lions Den, there became a public enemy number one. Tito Ortiz. The young college wrestler had impressed a lot of people even in just 2 appearances, and matched up against Lion Team's member Jerry Bolander, Ortiz went to town, and a doctor's stoppage by cut was already enough to piss off Ken, but then Tito threw on a shirt that ignited a rivalry between the self-proclaimed Huntington Beach bad boy and the Lion's Den. By the time Frank had defended his title in Brazil, Tito had gotten through Guy Mezger and looked like the toughest challenger that Shamrock had ever faced. It's no surprise that going into it, the UFC were marketing it as Shamrock being out for revenge against Tito on behalf of the Lions Den, but of course Frank had left that team a while ago now. But it was enough for Frank's dad Bob to pick up the phone and call him. He told him not to fight Tito, that Ken said he was the wrong style for Frank and he was too big and too strong.
Everyone thinks he's going to beat me, but the science says I'm going to kick his ass.
According to Frank, he saw where the UFC was going. The terrible marketing tactics focusing on the brutality was only backing the promotion into a corner.
Calling Ultimate Fighting a sport is a complete misnomer.
They have no right to tell me what I can do with my body.
If we can't ban it, we're certainly going to put in place the most stringent regulations.
The difference between us and wrestling, of course, is these guys are real.
I came in at the absolute worst time of the sport. We lost 90% of our audience on, TCI Time Warner. It was the smallest audience with the smallest number with the least amount of money.
He had his lawyer write up a contract stating if he won, he could leave the UFC. Ortiz vs. Shamrock would go on to be essentially the pinnacle of MMA in the 90s.
Yeah, he wanted to leave?
People have called it MMA's rope-a-dope. Shamrock takes damage and takes damage, but he hangs on as Tito gets more tired and more tired and more tired.
I was going 100% nonstop, like a bull. And I remember in the beginning of the 4th round, I looked over at him, he was just bouncing. not even breathing.
There's Tito hanging on for dear life while Frank Shamrock is hammer fisting him. And Tito goes down and the fight is stopped. It was a moment that proved that Frank Shamrock probably was the best fighter of his time.
And that was, I think, Frank Shamrock's defining fight.
It had been 4 title defenses in a row for Frank.
No one's going to beat me ever till I get bored of this game.
All Bob Merowitz, the co-creator of the UFC and president of SEG, could do was just pass Frank the belt, stunned by what he'd seen.
First of all, that was just one of the greatest fights I've ever seen. And you are the greatest champion to ever grace the octagon. This is your belt. My friend, if you want to retire it, you take it home with you because you earned it more than anybody else ever has.
The greatest champion in UFC history would also be given the Fight of the Year honors by most publications against Tito, as well as Fighter of the Year by Full Contact Fighter magazine. And by the end of the year, the Wrestling Observer named him the best fighter of the entire 90s. There was no Hall of Fame then, but if there had been, it would have been unquestionable that he would have been given his place. He probably could have been the reason the Hall of Fame was even started.
Facts.
But nothing of the sort happened because the UFC was not in a good place, and Frank was sticking to his master plan.
You know, I'm good right now. Just retiring my belt, concentrating on my marriage. I think I'm going to leave this belt in the ring here for the next crew to pick up and retire my title tonight.
And about 2 weeks later, he was already acting in his first job, appearing on an episode of Walker, Texas Ranger. Everything went according to his plan. He found a manager and an agent right away and quickly started booking commercials, something fairly easy to do as a former UFC champion. Shamrock even managed to land himself in a movie, one of the world's first attempts at doing an MMA movie. Let me tell you guys, this was intense.
I know who you are and what you've done. I watched you kill my family. This is the last face you'll ever see.
Damn.
You just made your last mistake. You will die.
And from here on out, Frank's relationship with the UFC steadily gets worse and worse. He decided to return to fighting, but not for the UFC. One of the biggest promotions in Japan at the time was K1, but they didn't do
K1.
MMA. Not yet, anyway. Frank had been completely open with the fact that going to work with them, he knew he was working for the Yakuza. Of course, that's if you believe him and what he wrote in his autobiography. And it was a big deal in Japan. Not only was it the first MMA fight, but the first ever being broadcast on Tokyo TV, which was like the CBS or NBC of Japan. They filled up the Tokyo Dome with 70,000 people. And Frank would be fighting a relative novice in comparison, Elvis Sinosik, Australian's first prospect to enter an international stage. And Frank came out looking to put a beating on the guy.
Oh! Get right!
Frank was looking as good as ever, teamed up with Maurice Smith and Javier Mendez. Other than some submission attempts, Frank continued to put it on Elvis, but he wasn't able to finish him, which definitely surprised a lot of people. In fact, Elvis would shortly find himself in a UFC title fight because of this performance. But the night Frank stood victorious in front of 70,000 Japanese fans, he'd also unknowingly brought about the prophecy he'd predicted. The UFC was going to die. Just 1 week later, the UFC were also in Japan, not at the Tokyo Dome, but the Diffa Ariake Arena, to an audience of just 1,400 people. The new and only poster boy the UFC had left, Tito Ortiz, destroyed a Japanese legend in just 2 minutes, and it signaled the end of the UFC as we knew it. It would be the last time we saw the Octagon in Japan for 12 years. SEG was so bankrupt that UFC 29 was a 7th straight event never released on home video or DVD, and just 1 month later, SEG would sell the UFC to Zuffa LLC, Dana White, and the Fertitta brothers.
Yeah.
And at this point in time, now I've put all the pieces out there, it's easy to see Frank Shamrock was already public enemy #1, or maybe they should have been thanking him. Still recognized as perhaps the greatest fighter of all time, but not in your promotion, the UFC, and the biggest star outside of it, ready to cripple your business. But at the same time, by leaving SEG in the dust and working with the enemy, it had truly left nothing for them to hold on to, and left Zuffa to take up the reins, and they apparently wanted Shamrock on board.
When the Fertittas bought the UFC, they hired me to consult them. So I flew to Las Vegas and I lived in the Station Casino and I trained Lorenzo and Dana every morning. At the end of 2 weeks, they pulled out their plan. And that was to remember the Carmen Electra and the Tito Ortiz and his tighties, whiteys with oil all over him.
Frank thought they needed to go about educating fans what MMA was as a sport.
I don't think we can just put a new face on it, shine it up and roll it out. And they were like, you're wrong. I never did business with them because I didn't believe in their marketing plan. After that is because I didn't join them, I became an adversary. People had no idea what was going on. They still thought it was John McCain, human cockfighting, people are dying. No one even knew we had rules. And then, yeah, the minute I didn't join the team, I was on the other team.
One of the main reasons he was supposedly agreeing to fight Elvis was that he'd made a deal with K1 to be a part of the massive new MMA league. Something he was going to be paid a ton of money to be involved in and use his brand and his image to promote it. He was going to help build a new MMA empire in Japan and then go to the US and compete with the UFC. Frank then supposedly hung around for over a year and a half in Japan while these deals and plans were being finalized, with endless meetings that soon became clear we're not going anywhere. It was around this time back in California that Shamrock had a meeting about another potential fight, but not in the UFC. In a California-based promotion, World Extreme Cage Fighting. In the wake of the success of the UFC, other promotions around the US had started to grow, and the WEC had been among them. In 2003, there was still nowhere near the same level, and they didn't even have a TV deal. But WEC 6, Return of a Legend, was enough to get Frank to fight again, and for the first time in 3 years, the event would also showcase a very young Gilbert Melendez, Nick Diaz, who fought for their first welterweight title, and headlining the show, Frank Shamrock, whose return to the sport had people fighting to get inside the Tachi Palace. It was a blowout performance, another first round submission, but Frank had no intentions of holding onto the title. Frank for the next few years seemed to support everything to do with MMA as long as it had nothing to do with the UFC. Chapter 4. Anything that's not the UFC. Frank's hopes would be answered by two idealistic MMA fans with more money than sense. Gareb Shamus and Kurt Otto were two MMA fans who also happened to want to make money like the UFC. They managed to raise $150 million in public stock and wanted to reinvent the sport. They were going for more of a team concept where they would face off, competing for points. The teams had coaches made up of legends, including the Shamrock brothers, but the company offered an actual paycheck for its fighters, as well as health benefits and insurance before the UFC were doing it. The UFC sued them as well for having access to their proprietary information. The IFL countersued, saying the UFC was threatening potential partners, including Fox Sports. But it was about to be the first MMA show to have a regularly scheduled time slot on TV, which turned out to not be a good thing. The show and promotion turned into a disaster and Frank Shamrock's worst nightmare.
Intense, fearless, brutal, with only one goal: be the last man standing.
It's the extreme physical challenge that proves pain is nothing but weakness leaving the body.
The IFL started emphasizing the extreme nature of the sport and opened with Frank Shamrock having to tell viewers his team was ready to fight to the death, while they played the sound of someone flatlining over a knockout. Basically, it made the sport look terrible and was undoing everything the UFC and Shamrock had tried to do to fall in line and make the sport look more regulated and official.
This is the hot, new, exciting sport. It's very pop culture. It's very action-oriented.
The average person watching this is on the other side of 50 going, oh my gosh, this is violent.
Well, at the end of the day, it's martial arts. And that's what people forget about. They see the violence come in front of the art. It's the real deal. It's as real as you can get.
The stocks came crashing down from $17 a share to less than $1. They ended up $36 million in debt, something I'm sure Dana White was very happy about. This project had certainly failed and his involvement had done nothing but make Dana White essentially see him as the enemy. But Shamrock was far from done trying to make MMA work outside of the UFC. After working with his longtime friend and kickboxing promoter Scott Coker, Frank decided to join forces and work to create a new MMA league. Strikeforce was set up by Coker in 1985, but up until that point, it had really been a kickboxing promotion. But that was all about to change. They'd known each other since the K1 days and respected each other, and for their first event, they needed a big name on the card, and Frank Shamrock once again decided to step back in the cage. And to get even more fan interest, they were reigniting a rivalry that had existed since the dawn of the sport. The Shamrocks versus the Gracies. While the Lion's Den was formed in Lodi, California, just down the road, only an hour's drive away, was Cesar Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, set up in the late 2000s and essentially in direct competition with the Lion's Den. The head of the team, Cesar, was the great nephew of the guy who had invented Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and with their roster of the Diaz brothers and other top fighters, they had truly become a force to be reckoned with. Frank Shamrock versus Cesar Gracie was enough of a spectacle that the fight became an instant sellout, setting a new record for paid attendance attendance at over 18,000, and it was also the first regulated MMA event in California. But Frank hadn't fought in 3 years. He was definitely past his prime, but he didn't consider Caesar much of a threat at all.
Been waiting to fight one of these Gracies for a long time, and I finally got one dumb enough to step in the ring with me.
Caesar at the time was also a bit of an unknown.
Gracie?
He never properly recorded MMA bouts, but apparently had a bunch of challenge matches in Brazil. But it showed in his performance as Frank came out and in just a few seconds completely dominated him.
Utilizes jiu-jitsu.
I figured I'd give him the old looping overhand right of death to see if he was paying attention, and obviously he wasn't. I mean, we set a record here, and I'm just glad that an independent show is making news like this.
After that, San Jose became the mecca of mixed martial arts in California. There was a lot of heat around the sport, but they still couldn't get a TV deal for Strikeforce, and they were determined to try, and while they were doing that, Dana White reached out to Shamrock one last time. They flew him in for a meeting, but as Frank tells it, it was apparently the same pitch he'd heard before. The deal was they'd give you a bunch of money and you'd fight exclusively for the UFC. You had to sign everything over, you had no rights, and when you were done, you would leave and that would be it. You're done forever.
I don't believe in what they're doing. I don't believe in Dana White. I think he's bad for the sport. I know he's taking advantage of the athletes currently. You want me to fight in the UFC? Scott Coker will fight Dana White. If Dana White wins, I will fight in the UFC free of charge.
Dana was asked about this by Sam Kaplan on CBS Sports, and he said, "I've talked to Frank Shamrock many times. Frank Shamrock will lead you to believe that we've never talked and we completely have hated each other forever and everything else. He's a weird guy. He's a very weird guy. I can't explain it. Frank is a weird guy." This final open hand offered by the UFC was the last. Of course, Shamrock had already promoted several US events that weren't in the UFC in direct competition, and he was about to start up another one with more support and backing than any had had before. Pro Elite and the television network Showtime had come together to found a new MMA promotion in December of 2006. It was called EliteXC. According to Frank, these guys were amazing, super nice, but didn't know anything about MMA, but had over $30 million to spend. And to continue with the Shamrock vs. Gracie theme, they booked one of the most notoriously expensive athletes in MMA, Renzo Gracie. The first EliteXC show, Destiny, was held in Mississippi, and the main card aired on Showtime with the undercard streamed over the Pro Elite website. It was a strong card. Gina Carano fought Julie Kedzie.
Okay, Gina Carano. Y'all actually told me to watch Gina Carano. That's coming. But damn, I ain't knew all this.
Cabbage for Antonio Silva, Crazy Horse knocked out KJ Noons, and then it was time for Frank to fight Renzo. After being side controlled in the first round by Renzo, Frank did something very illegal in round 2. But he didn't even know you couldn't throw that strike anymore. It was a bit of a wake-up call for Frank. The rules of the sport had changed and he didn't even realize. It was Shamrock's first loss in 10 years.
My game plan was a safe one. I was going to fatigue him out. I was going to wear him out. Gracie really stole something from the fans on that one. And I've been in that situation where I've had to make that decision. Do I take it? Do I walk away? Do I find a way out? I lost some respect for him in that area. He had the mental...
I mean, you did knee him in the head. I mean, could he even came back from that and fought after that? Yes, but he probably would have got knocked out. That knee in the head.
Awareness.
Damn.
That he was about to get horribly knocked out, and if he just walked away, he could win.
He felt screwed by Pro Elite. He asked them to appeal and support him, but they didn't. He knew the Elite people didn't know what they were doing, but turns out he didn't either. He told himself he wasn't thinking like a fighter anymore. What kind of a fighter doesn't even know the rules? But Frank did keep fighting. He went back to Strikeforce to headline another show with his partner Scott Coker, this time fighting for the new middleweight title against an old rival, Phil Baroni.
Frank Shamrock's talking a big game, He's gonna stand on me, he's gonna knock me out. I'm the fucking knockout artist.
Baroni talked a big game and had been part of the broadcast team, often talking about fighting Frank. The crowd and the atmosphere was intense, everyone was into the rivalry, and Frank started to take over.
Will he be able to kill the New York Badass? Listen to the crowd behind Shamrock. He's out. He's out.
Choking his ass out.
Is your Strikeforce World Middleweight Champion.
Frank would continue to stay in Strikeforce and help promote another massive show where he defended his title against Scott Coker's new golden boy, the kickboxer Kung Lee. And it was the first time we saw Frank get thoroughly beaten down.
What?
Eventually breaking Frank's arm with a kick. Frank was forced to quit, and it was clear his fighting days were almost behind him. and he once again turned his attention back to promoting for an event that would become one of the most watched and most controversial MMA events of all time, EliteXC Heat. Although the Pro Elite guys might not have known what they were doing, they had certainly won the lottery when they picked up the viral YouTube star Kimbo Slice and had been promoting his MMA fights. His last win over James Thompson put him as 3-0 as a pro, and was the first time that EliteXC had reached an agreement with the CBS network to broadcast fights live on Saturday nights. This time Kimbo would be fighting none other than Frank's brother, Ken. Backstage while preparing for the fight, somehow Ken had gotten a cut, throwing the main event into extreme jeopardy at the last minute. But Frank thought there was more to the story.
I don't believe anybody who has been a professional as long as he has would put himself in a situation that will allow himself to be cut. But I think that Ken was upset that he wasn't being compensated like Kimbo was.
Frank believed Ken had found out about Kimbo's pay and thrown some kind of diva fit backstage. And he was one of the guys trying to figure out what to do, and when Ken couldn't fight, Frank volunteered himself. But then the word came from Kimbo's camp, absolutely not. It was a question of skill level. He was a bigger guy, and if Frank went out there and smashed him, it would not look good for Kimbo.
And I had, up until an hour before that show, thought I was going to fight Kimbo in the main event.
Instead, Slice's team accepted a fight with Seth Petrozelli on short notice. This was the guy who'd basically failed in the UFC, and when the fight started, Seth absolutely...
He's supposed to have fought Kid Shamrock? There's no fucking way. Dang. And he ended up losing a dude. That's crazy. I didn't know the Shamrocks was behind all this, bro. Bro, what?
Steamrolled the biggest draw in EliteXC.
As soon as they said he was going to take that fight, we were concerned about it. The guy saved our show. It was a really, really strong move by him.
A lot of people are saying this is now the end of EliteXC because, you know, their top dog just got knocked out in a pretty impressive fashion. Would you agree with that statement?
Oh, definitely not the end of it.
To make things worse, Seth made a statement afterwards that EliteXC had paid him extra to not take Kimbo to the ground. The story spread like wildfire, and spurred on by Dana White, EliteXC were investigated for fight fixing.
That's fucking illegal.
EliteXC quickly folded, going from the most watched MMA show of all time to shutting their doors due to significant debt with no buyers or investors showing interest just 16 days after the fight. EliteXC was over. But Frank's feud with Dana White was not. As the sport continued to move forward, the resentment between the two men just continued to build.
He just happens to be angry and bully and likes to, you know, make retorts to that. Who cares? We got to get New York legal. So I've got a big initiative and, you know, a bunch of charity and community campaigns to do that. I'm moving to New York to do it because I'm on this mission to get mixed martial arts approved in New York. That's my job and that's my life.
Frank Shamrock said on my show this past week about you being the reason why MMA has not been legalized in New York.
Frank Shamrock is an irrelevant jackass. Frank Shamrock, I bet he didn't say on your radio show that he flew out to my office a month ago, sat down with me and tried to make peace with me. Did he tell you that?
No.
Because you're a two-faced lying chump. What have you done for mixed martial arts in the last 10 years? I don't want to work with a douchebag like him. He's a two-faced liar. I can't stand the guy.
Strikeforce acquired the defunct assets of...
Well, how y'all feel in the comments, man? Tell me how y'all feel about Frank in the comments, man. I don't know. Damn. He wasn't the legend, don't get it wrong. He a savage. He wasn't the original savages, but...
EliteXC and was still airing on Showtime, and Frank came back one last time to face off against Nick Diaz, who'd been dominating in EliteXC. Shamrock was well past his prime, but as a student of Cesar Gracie, the fight made sense from a rivalry perspective, but now more than ever it was clear Shamrock was far from the legendary fighter he had been. Nick put on a relentless pace and battered Shamrock.
I had to get that one done for my coach. I say, get up, you're a legend.
Since his retirement after the Diaz fight, there has been endless talk about Frank Shamrock deserving a position in the UFC Hall of Fame. But it seems Dana White will never let that happen. Speaking to MMA junkies as far back as 2012, telling them maybe there's going to be a mixed martial arts Hall of Fame, maybe Frank Shamrock has a place there that makes more sense because in the last 11 years that I've been here, that jackass hasn't done one thing, as far as I've seen, to further the sport or the UFC. MMA writer Josh Gross continued to bring up the subject for years, and in 2017, when former UFC PR member Ant Evans was rebuilding the Hall of Fame, he actually considered including Frank Shamrock versus Tito Ortiz, recognizing it for what it was, one of the biggest and most important UFC fights ever for its time. But the UFC didn't reach out to Shamrock. Apparently though, according to Josh, Ant Evans pushed Dana White enough to budge though and get him to consider Frank, going so far as to say it would be wonderful for the sport spot in its history. Frank was expected to agree to a 2-page letter of intent covering his trip to Vegas, the ceremony, and everything. But apparently, according to Evans, he became paranoid about the whole thing, fearing he'd be double-crossed in some way. Shamrock was still speaking out of turn against the UFC in interviews while this process was going on, and so really neither party could trust each other. They didn't trust Frank not to go on stage and wreck the evening, and Shamrock didn't trust him to play fair. Really, the final thought on Frank from a lot of these guys was that he liked his outsider status better. Being known as the guy that deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, but never being included, makes him special in his own unique way. Shamrock remained adamant that the UFC controls the market share, and while that's happening, they can retell history however they want. And to this day, and as long as that is the case, one of the greatest and most influential fighters of all time will never get a place in the UFC Hall of Fame.
I mean, the UFC do got, their market share is, yeah, that's true. I mean, they can erase you if they want to. I mean, but they ain't gonna erase you, Shamrock, bro. You remember now, bro. I won't let them erase you, my man. You won't be forgotten. Trust.
All right, and that is pretty much the whole.
We remember. We remember, bro. We remember. This man's first 3 fights, he beat Baz Rutten and Fanaki, or however you say his name. That is, bro, what? I mean, I understand what he was doing. He felt like he was backstabbed, but that shit crazy, bro. A lot of these legends, bro, especially from back in the day, bro, it's a lot of stuff that be going on that you would never know until you actually watch these videos. Like, I would have never knew that. That's crazy, bro. Look, man, like, comment, subscribe. But let me know in the comments what y'all think about this, man. But I'm saying this, man, no cap.